This is a story I wrote after a Tumblr prompt, or I guess a series of Tumblr prompts. Not really prompts, I guess, but more like just, people, writers, saying, oh, I hate stories about, vampires being all angsty and shit because, I like to think about, what happens if a vampire's just living a normal everyday life, and I came across this post about them being annoyed by motion sensors because they can't set them off for whatever reason. And I found one about having a vampire as a history teacher. I think the post started off as just being about vampires, oh, you were around in the 1700s. Oh, what was the American Revolution like? I don't know. I was in China, and then just moving to having them be history teachers. So this is kind of my, I guess, taking that idea and running away with it. I think I posted this story actually on that Tumblr post, if anyone can ever find it. If you go back far enough in my archives on my Tumblr, I'm sure you'll come across it. If you want to find that post. But here, without further ado, here is ancient history. The day they walked into the history classroom of Mr. Marcel would turn out to be one of the strangest of their lives. Being sophomores, most of the students were able to find the classroom before the bell rang. There was that one girl who seemingly had nothing better to do than to make her way to class as fast as possible, who looked around for the teacher for a moment, perhaps wondering about a chart, before grabbing a seat in the second row. Then most of the other kids showed up. The dorks, the jocks, the basic bitches. So many basic bitches. What did they even do with their lives? And slowly, talking and laughing, they found seats. Finally, the perpetually late stoner kid wandered in, looking a little lost 2 seconds after the bell rang, before the transfer student almost barreled past him, panicked at being late on his first day. The students looked around, and the classroom gradually fell silent as they realized several things in quick succession, which they whispered to each other in confusion. First, all of the shades in the windows were closed, nor were many of the lights on, leaving the classroom in a state of perpetual murkiness. Second, the teacher, this Mr. Marcel that none of them had ever heard of, was nowhere to be found. It was very strange for a teacher to be late on the first day of class. Muttering darkly to each other, it was a long minute before anyone did anything. Finally, Cynthia, the student council president, took a deep breath and stood. Well, the least we can do is open a shade, make this at least a little less depressing. She strode confidently to the far wall, largely consisting of smudged glass covered by cheap, half-broken shades. But just as she reached out a hand to grab the cord, though it was hit or miss whether it would actually open the shade or just tangle hopelessly, a chair squeaked. "Don't touch that, please," requested a voice, and the students turned to see through the gloom that a man was sitting behind the teacher's desk in the usual swirly chair, reclining as his feet rested over the dull wooden surface of the desk. Had he been there the entire time? He couldn't have been. The students would have noticed, wouldn't they? It was terribly dramatic. The stoner kid was impressed, for he was the only one who had seen the smoke that had snuck through the gap under the door and taken the form of, presumably, their new teacher. Cynthia, however, had no time for meaningless drama. She had AP credits to complete and tests to study for, because unless she got her A- in calculus up to that A, her life would be over. "Why shouldn't I?" she asked. Mr. Marcel smiled, though only half his mouth moved. "That, my dear, is a very dangerous question," he grunted, leaning forward. Tutting in disgust, Cynthia rolled her eyes. "That's not a real answer. For a teacher, you're being awfully vague." He laughed, and most of the children turned some shade of white. It wasn't a particularly terrifying laugh, nor was it unfriendly, but there was something about it that sent shivers down all of their spines. The early girl, who had already finished writing 2 novels, if anyone ever bothered to ask her, would have described it as the laugh of a predator. Ooh, that was good. She'd have to remember that one. She scribbled it down in her notebook. "If you must know," Mr. Marcel drawled, "it's because I find I'm rather sensitive to light. It's a rare condition, I'm afraid." Not at all satisfied, but realizing that this was the most she was going to get out of him, Cynthia returned to her seat in a huff. She crossed her arms over her small chest, which she hated to admit how self-conscious she was about, and watched the teacher stand slowly from the desk with narrowed eyes. "In case you hadn't already guessed, I am Mr. Marcel, your history teacher." He swayed a little, as if he hadn't eaten in far too long. Or he was high, the stoner kid guessed. He wanted to know where he could get some shit like that. "Now, I'm told that you are all darling students who are interested in taking an advanced alternative to U.S. history, but for now I'm reserving judgment. If you want my honest opinion, most of you look like little cockalorums to me." Cynthia could have sworn he'd glanced pointedly in her direction. Though she had no idea just what a cockalorum was, she turned red and shrunk in her chair nonetheless. She was sure now that everyone was staring at her, but in reality, absolutely no one had noticed. Yawning, Mr. Marcel ran a finger through his dark, bed-headed mop. The early girl couldn't help noticing how sharp his canine teeth were. Her highly trained writing mind immediately thought vampire, but she shook it off. That was impossible. That was just shit she wrote about in her more weird fanfiction. Stoner Kid, on the other hand, didn't have a doubt in his mind. Fucking wicked, man. This was going to be awesome. History, Mr. Marcel muttered, pacing a little. There is an awful lot of it. Where to start? Why not just start at the beginning, like a sane person? Cynthia asked, raising an eyebrow. He stared at her, and she froze. She could have sworn that his eyes flashed red for just a second, but she shook off the feeling. That was ridiculous. She was just seeing things. All right, then, he conceded, nabbing the textbook that she'd placed carefully on the front of her desk, much to her anguish. Let's see, according to the state-mandated truth, all hail Big Brother. He deadpanned, which was met with silence. Come on, 1984, people. Pick up a book sometime. Anyway, according to this textbook, the first civilization to exist was... Hold on. That's not right. He flipped a few pages back, then a few pages forward, all the while balancing the large book on a knee as he sat on his desk. It says that the first civilization was ancient Mesopotamia, but that's complete and utter bullshit. They've forgotten all about Lemuria. Piped up a voice from the back, and everyone turned to stare at the new transfer student, who was just beginning to notice that between all the spray tans and pale Midwestern skin, his was the darkest face in the room. Mr. Marcel tilted his head. Yes? He asked as the transfer student almost lost his nerve. You'll have to speak up. I'm far older than my dashing looks suggest. Cynthia rolled her eyes. Isn't Lemuria just a myth? The transfer student choked out from behind thick glasses, which appeared to be steaming up from the sudden heat of his face. Eyes widening like an owl, Mr. Marcel stood abruptly, almost speechless. A myth? He spat, pale cheeks almost threatening to show a shade of color. Just a myth? What sort of hogwash are they teaching you all? By now, 3/4 of the students thought he was absolutely insane. 3 already had their cell phones out in an attempt to call for help. Stoner Kid just shook his head. That obviously wasn't going to work. Of course, just as he thought this, all 3 cell phones immediately shut themselves off. Portable telephones away, children, Mr. Marcel said, and the students' mouths widened. He hadn't even been looking in their direction. And listen up, because now you're going to learn some real history.